My name is David Klein. This event is hosted by System Change, Not Climate Change, and we expect the event to last about 75 minutes. System Change, Not Climate Change is a network of eco-socialists who recognize that capitalism is the fundamental driver of the climate and ecological crisis. Capitalism's business plan is to wreck the planet for the sake of corporate profits. System Change, Not Climate Change rejects green capitalism and supports unity with the labor movement and First Nations and Indigenous and other struggles to create an alternative eco-socialist system of human relations. We are based primarily in the United States and Canada, but our perspective is internationalist and anti-imperialist, and we welcome new members. Please check out our website, systemchangenotclimatechange.org, systemchangenotclimatechange with no spaces.org. Our topic today is plastic and its destructive effects worldwide. Plastic is pervasive. It permeates every corner of the globe, and the explosive growth of plastics in the last few decades is an illustrative example of capitalism's requirement for perpetual growth and its unsustainability. The combined weight of plastics in the ocean could, in the very near future, exceed the mass of all fish in the ocean. It is a health threat to humans, and it threatens Earth's biosphere. Here to talk about it are the authors of a revealing series of articles on the plastic crisis available on our website at systemchangenotclimatechange.org. Our first speaker, Alex Hartzog, was the System Change, Not Climate Change journalism intern this summer and concentrated on reporting and writing the series on plastic pollution that informs this webinar. He'll graduate from Ithaca College in New York State this December with a degree in journalism and minors in linguistics and education studies. He's also working and podcasting long-form stories about labor issues for WICB-FM radio. Conversant in Japanese, he'll be looking for a job in the new year and is open to offers. Maurice Stevens is an independent journalist and anti-racism, environmental, labor, and peace activist, or JACtivist, as well as theater artist, educator, creative writer, and editor. A lifetime sustainability advocate and anti-capitalist for many years, she ran an organic farm in central New York. Maura has written hundreds of articles and white papers and taught subjects ranging from climate change to the invasion of Iraq to vermiculture, subjects that are connected in one way or many. A co-founder of the Coalition to Protect New York, Frack Busters New York, and other grassroots organizations. She is a member of the System Change, Not Climate Change Coordinating Committee and the National Writers Union. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this event over to Alex, who will speak for about 25 minutes, followed by Maura, and thereafter we'll take questions from the audience.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Alex. I will be leading this initial part of the webinar. So let me just figure out how to share screens for a little bit. And we can get started. So plastics, the other pandemic, that was the main idea of the article series that Maura and I helped write. So first off, let's kind of get into a little bit about me. You heard some from David a little earlier about stuff that I am doing. I am a senior at Ithaca College studying journalism with minors in education studies and linguistics. Those are kind of like my main interests in terms of study and field. But when it comes to journalism, I'm really interested in environmental science and advocacy, and that kind of led me to apply to be an intern at System Change, Not Climate Change for the summer. And basically when I got the job, I was thinking, okay, what am I going to write about here? I'm very new to like this anti-capitalist, eco-socialist network. Like, what am I going to do in this? And I basically said, I'm really interested in plastic and how everything in the past 2 years and past decade has impacted uh, the environment, and seeing what is being done about that now. And that kind of informed what I was doing all summer. I did research and reporting, basically just covering what the heck was happening with plastics and what we might be able to do about them. Currently, I am working with Tokusatsu Network doing translation work. So I just, very different from what I was doing over the summer. This is much more just about translation and news briefs rather than advocacy. And I'm doing a little bit of advocacy with labor issues in the Ithaca area through Ithaca College's WICB, but still very different from what I was doing this summer. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I'm doing this summer. I did this summer. So I had one real driving question. What is going on with plastics? And it kind of broke down into a bunch of different things that kind of made into the article and some that didn't. And I'm kind of going to talk about that now. So COVID was obviously a massive driver in what we saw in the past year and 2 years for that matter, about how plastic was impacting our day-to-day lives, how COVID was changing our usage of plastic, and so on and so forth. I remember seeing a headline that saying air pollution dropped, but even if air pollution dropped, does that mean we were better for the environment? And the answer is not really so, because we drastically increased our usage of plastic through stuff like takeout, delivery, and all the other different things that I'm about to get into later. Also, there was, right before the pandemic, China had changed its policies on plastics, which changed a lot of how the back end of the plastic life cycle ends. So that was a massive change. Additionally, we were seeing plastic bag bans right before the pandemic, and pandemic kind of shoved that all out of the way. And now there's lots of advocacy groups, many of which I talked to over the summer, that were trying to get the gears going again and trying to get these bans to be active and to move further than just plastic bags. Because as great as it sounds, plastic bags really only make up a couple percent of the overall usage of plastic in our society. And also I looked into CO2 emissions and seeing kind of what the impact of plastic specifically had on all of the global warming stuff that we're seeing and the climate catastrophe that we are currently living through. So to start off, I had to go, okay, what is going on with plastic? And move even further back than that and say, what is plastic? Because I'm sure we all know something about plastic. We have plastic all over in our houses. And if you just take a second to look at most of your house, you will see plastic everywhere. So why is it so prevalent? What even is it? So I went and looked, and basically it's a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry. I knew they were related tangentially, at least before I started doing research, but I actually found through lots of research and just straight up information from people like ExxonMobil that plastic is just a byproduct of making the fossil fuels, which are already destroying our environment. So it's a petrol-based polymer, right? And basically when we're making petrol, there's all these extra stuff that is left over, and that ends up becoming eventually the plastics we use everywhere. And it's made up of carbon and other chemicals as stabilizers, and none of them are good for the environment, yet we continuously use them every single place we can. They're in landfills, the Atlantic and Pacific gyres, just floating around, just generating massive things the size of Texas of just pure plastic, roughly. They're in our streets, in our toys, in our food, and they're in us. We have baby poop has 10 times more microplastic in it than adult poop from a study. That just came out a few days ago. And then earlier in that, we found that people were eating about a credit card's worth of plastic every single week. And that's ending up inside our body, it's leaving our body, it's going into the rest of the environment. And no one's really talking about the fact that, like, what effects does this have on people? There's lots of studies coming out that are saying, oh, there's not much going on, but those are very much state-backed, plastic-backed. They're not actually digging deep into these issues. And that was an issue I was kind of confused about. So I did a little more research into all of that. And that is presented in the articles that were released over the past couple of weeks. So here's this chart. Basically, I don't believe we ended up using it in the article, but it basically shows the pipeline from natural resources to plastics, and everything in between them is basically creating at least CO2 at the minimum. Or then it's also creating other wastes from all the other plastics and chemicals that we are using to create more plastic. And it's just a whole pipeline that just goes straight from the fossil fuel industry to plastic. And of course, they're connected. I mean, here we see in a grocery store, we've all been around different grocery stores in the world, and we see everything is wrapped in plastic. You want to get some bell peppers like I did last week. The only way to get bell peppers, they came in little plastic carts wrapped in more plastic. And most of that wasn't even recyclable plastic. So plastic is everywhere. I think I've put that home at this point. So moving on to China. It used to be the #1 importer of used plastics in the world. Basically, America would ship all of its plastic to China. China would pay for it a little bit, like a small amount to pay for it. Other countries do the same. So basically, China was this massive influx of plastic from around the world, and they utilized it to create lesser plastic products. So what that kind of means is that you would take, say, a toy and it got thrown out. That toy would be melted down and turned into something less than a toy. It would be turned into recycled plastic stuff that you really only get to use one time. It's not something that's constantly being used, as the plastic industry likes you to believe. This is a massive change. So they basically stopped collecting plastic completely from outside sources in China. This basically cut off the entire supply chain of plastic to China and left countries like the US. Now we have massive landfills that are just filling up with plastic that we used to be sending to China, which oftentimes would end up in their landfills. So it's a really like toxic system that just wasn't working. And China also has been drastically curtailing its usage of plastic, so through things like the plastic bag ban. And is that really enough to say that they're working hard to change the work against climate change? Not really. And what we found is that as much as China's like doing all these things to like prevent the usage of plastic and the importing of plastic and the plastic supply chain, it's not stopping enough of the plastic entering our environment to actually make a noticeable change. And this has also had a ripple effect through other countries, such as Malaysia, Indonesia. They also have stopped accepting plastics from other countries because of pressure from China, as far as I was able to extrapolate from different sources that I talked to and researched. So CO2e emissions, that is carbon dioxide. The E is like on average or like general emissions. And in one of the studies I was reading, they found that globally in 2015, emissions from cracking, that is the process of turning like ethylene into plastic, were 184.3 to 213.0 million metric tons of CO2e, as much as 45 million passenger vehicles driven for 1 year. And that was a big number that doesn't quite make sense. And what I found was that the concept they were using of a passenger vehicle is a 2-axle car driven like 4 hours a day. That is a really abstract way of looking at what that emissions is. And it's not quite a helpful indicator of how much CO2 is being produced just from ethylene. And that's only one kind of plastic that we found. And I talk about a bunch of them in one of the articles titled Types of Plastics, which is on systemchange.climatechange.org. And as I'll get into later, this is only one step in the process. Cracking to produce ethylene is just one stage. That's the production and refinement stages. It's either or, depending on how you want to look at it in the grand scheme of things. But in the production, there's generation of CO2. In the refinement and cracking process, that's more CO2. Then you shape it, and you need to use steam and heat. And in order to do that, you're burning fossil fuels. That is more CO2. You're transporting it through trucks and cars and planes. That's even more CO2. And then when we're finally done with it, we throw it out. It ends up in a landfill or in the ocean. And now there's studies coming out that show that the heat and UV radiation from the sun is actually causing anything that does break down to release more carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. through different reactions in the sea and in landfills. So it's a whole mess, and it just sucks. Like, that's basically how that works out. Plastic is, as I'm sure we're all aware, horrible for the environment, and it's more horrible than we thought the more we learn about it. And then I looked into recycling. That was something I was like, okay, if plastics are that bad, maybe we can just recycle them and make something at least a little better out of them. And then we found that only 10% of plastics are recycled in general. And that sounds crazy because I put all of my plastic in a recycling bin and I give it to the recycling plant. The recycling plant takes it. How does only 10% of that end up getting recycled? And a large part of that is misinformation and communication errors and inefficiencies in the recycling plants. So first off, not every recycling plant takes the same recyclables, just in general. In Ithaca, where I am right now, we accept 1, 2, 3, and 5. That means 6 and 7 and 4 are not able to be recycled. But if you ask Ithaca College, where I physically live, they will accept 1 through 7, which is just false. So they're telling their students to do one thing, even though they physically can't do what they're telling them to do. And there's just a bunch of communication errors like that all throughout the country. I also live in Philly when I'm not in school, and they say they collect 1 through 7, but in order to do that, they have to ship it to a bunch of different places that can specifically deal with those. And that is just a lot of waste, and there's a lot that ends up going missing. And some trash services do not accept 1 through 7. So you have to check with your trash service of whether or not they'll actually recycle it. And there's so much work front loaded on the person that it gets lost in it, and you have no idea what's even able to be recycled in your area. And we see plastic codes, and people say, oh, plastic code, that means I can recycle it. But no, they all have a little number in them. The image I have here does not have a number in it, but basically in the center of it, there would be a number. And even my own roommates, who have explained this to many times, thought that as long as there was that thing, they could recycle it. And then I had to tell them to actually look at the number. And now they're never sure what they can recycle now that I've told them to look at the numbers. So it's just a bad system that we were never fully taught. Even if we were fully taught it, the system changes, and the system is not like standard between any place because everywhere has their own way of dealing with plastics. And there's been shifts that are like, okay, if that's complicated, what if we do bio-based or biodegradable plastics that'll just break down in our environment? And what we found is that bio-based and biodegradable are two very different things. For starters, bio-based means it comes from stuff like cornstarch or corn or any other, like something you could find in nature, and then you take the oil from that and you make that into a bio-based plastic. Sure, but that doesn't mean it's going to biodegrade. And something that's biodegradable might not be bio-based. So when it degrades, it turns into something that wasn't in nature previously and is still bad for the environment. So they're both bad. And you have to find one that's both. And currently, there's very few bio-based, biodegradable plastics. And that is an issue that people are currently looking into and looking for ways to solve. Some of the sources I talked to are actually currently looking into that, like the Footprint Foundation. Yes, Footprint Foundation. And they are looking for ways to make that better. It's not just moving to paper straws. Paper straws are not the solution. They make up less than 1% of all plastic used in nature. So, and we also had the issue of COVID. People were delivering way more. They were not getting DiGiorno. And if they were having it delivered to them through stuff like Peapod, Instacart, stuff like that. I worked at a supermarket over the pandemic, and I saw how many people were getting other people to go and get their stuff. So increase in plastic usage. They might have been using paper bags, but they typically weren't because Philadelphia did not have a plastic bag ban, and they pushed it back because of COVID. People were getting more takeout. The plastic corporations, such as the like Progressive Plastic Association of America, they change their name every couple of years anytime they get in a bunch of drama. Super fun. Basically, they were trying to push that plastic is way more COVID friendly because it's single use. But COVID will stick on a surface, if it sticks at all, the same amount it would on cotton, polyester, or plastic. There's a negligible difference between the multiple types of bags you could use, and plastics are just worse for the environment. And there's also been stuff coming out that says, oh, in order to offset the carbon emissions from making your cotton bag, you have to use it 30,000 times. Sure, but you probably will as long as you take good care of your bag. That's just a side tangent. Moving back to this, COVID has also caused a huge delay in legislation. Specifically, plastic bag bans in New York were pushed back months. California pushed different ones around their area several times, and some were just outright canceled, like in Utah, I believe. So it's created a lot of issues and a lot of setbacks for environmental advocacy, plastic bans, virgin plastic bans, and everything in between. Here's a graph from, I believe this is a CL report, the Center for Investigative Environmental Law, one of the two, and International Investigative. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting that at the moment. But basically, they looked at what we're currently doing, which is in the yellow here, the top line. Basically, if we continue to produce plastic and use it at the same rate we're doing, it's still going up, even though we have like these different accords, which are saying this is what we need to do to stop the plastic production, stop CO2 production, stop plastic entering our ocean. And if we go with some of the ambitious targets, which are not even accepted yet, it's still going up. So even things that are currently being talked about as things we should do or might want to do in government is not good enough, because it's still going to continue going up, and we're not getting to net zero. We're not even getting to like net +5. We're getting way more than that. And they ran calculations. They said, what would we have to do in order to get down to 2010 levels? That was still bad, but at least it's not positive from where we are now. And they found that all the ambitious targets, they had to be 4 to 5 times more ambitious than they were in order to actually make a difference in society. And that was a really hard thing to read, because I was like, okay, if we keep on pushing for legislation, we'll eventually get something done. But what's in like law right now is seen as ambitious, and anything more is like, oh, we could never get this passed. And it needs to be more than that. And if it needs to be more than that, how are we ever going to get there with just passing laws? And that was something I grappled with for quite a while as I was writing this. So where are we going? We have just seen all of this bad things that plastic has done. We've seen all of the things that COVID has changed about plastic. We've seen what it's doing to people. It's just bad in general. And people are like, okay, let's do legislations like plastic bans and plastic bag bans and virgin plastic production caps so that you can't produce new plastic, you can only reuse plastic. And then there's other places that are like, okay, what if we regulate the uses of plastic so you can't use it in X, Y, and Z scenario? But as we saw, these current initiatives are not going to be enough. They just will not be. And that is an issue that we have to face at some point. Hopefully, legislation can get there, but as we're seeing, it really can't. Single-use plastic constitutes 40% of plastic used each year. So that is a quote taken from one of the studies I cited in the article. I'm sorry, I probably should have put who said that specifically. But basically, if single-use plastic is 40%, if we're curtailing single-use plastic, that still leaves 60% of plastic that we generate in a year that's not being curtailed whatsoever. And sure, 40% sounds like a lot that we're getting rid of if we get rid of it wholesale completely. But that's just like 60% is still a massive amount. It's billions of tons of carbon dioxide and plastic eventually ending up in our ocean. As David said earlier, the weight of plastic in the ocean may exceed the weight of living material in the ocean. And it's not that it may, it will. And we're eventually going to reach that point. And people are still going to be like, well, it's not an issue. It is an issue. And unless we do something drastic, nothing's going to change. Recycling is largely, in my opinion, kind of a waste of effort. Not necessarily like it's a bad idea. It's just that so much is wrong with the way we recycle and how little we're actually recycling compared to what we can recycle, that it's not really helping society or nature, because we're sending things to be recycled and they end up not getting recycled at all. So it's like horseshoes and hand grenades, close is not good enough. We need something that's actually going to work. And until we can figure that out, in my opinion, recycling is kind of a dead-end street for saving the environment. But what can you do? You can learn about your local recycling plan and at least try, say, if your town is still on average of 10%, you can push that. Maybe your personal plastic recycling is closer to 50 or 60%. Just anything more than the minimum is some way you can at least try to help. You can buy food that does not come in plastic, but in order to do that, you have to be able to afford it, because normally those types of foods are much, much more expensive. And you have to go through a lot of different hoops to get things that don't have plastic in them in at least the US. And it's just a negative feedback loop that's going to be very difficult to break out of. But as long as you try, we can at least try to get somewhere outside of just business as usual. And reusable bags, as I said earlier, are a good step forward, but they're not really going to make a massive impact because you have to use them over years. So once everyone switches over to them, and maybe decades down the line, they'll be great. But for now, they're more of a nice alternative than an actual solution. Now on to Maura for what her opinions on actual solutions will be.
Okay, our next speaker is Maura, and please hold your questions for Alex until Maura's done, and then we'll pose questions to both speakers. Okay, so Maura, go ahead.
Thanks, David. Hi, I'm Maurice Stevens, coming to you from beautiful Costa Rica at the moment. And that was really awesome, Alex. You're a hard act to follow. You sure have incorporated this subject into your thinking, and I'm really impressed. So you did a great job. I'm going to start with something personal. I'm a lot older than Alex, in case you couldn't tell. And my grandparents and parents both lived through the Great Depression and World War II. They incorporated the hardships and the frugality that they learned during that time into our own family motto, which was reduce, reuse, and recycle. And this is long before it became a popular slogan. I've written quite a bit about that, and my dad was an energy engineer, so he was very aware of the short lifespan of fossil fuels. And he and we were very excited at the first Earth Day in 1970, and we were sure that fossil fuels would be completely eliminated and replaced by renewables by about mid-1980s. Unfortunately, we were wrong. The 1970s were a time of some environmental progress, if you discount the wars and Agent Orange and other chemicals. But much of that progress was lost in the 1980s when President Jimmy Carter's solar panels on the White House were replaced. I'm having a little trouble with my slideshow here. Were replaced by or taken away by his successor, Ronald Reagan, who set the environmental and many other movements back while boosting corporate power and shrinking corporate accountability. At the same time, though, people became aware of how bad plastics were and how long they were going to live in our environment. There were a lot of recycling efforts that were usually run by municipalities, but plastics continued to proliferate. And now here we are, as Alex pointed out, even the most zealous anti-plastics advocates are surrounded in it. Also, as Alex pointed out, the average person in the United States and similar countries are eating the equivalent of a credit card's worth of microplastics every week, which is pretty terrifying. We now know about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and the others in all the world's oceans, and about the mountains of plastics that might have been recycled, but otherwise end up in landfills on our beaches, in our rivers and lakes, in our backyards, and even in our breast milk. And of course, it's not just humans who are affected. And here's a warning, the next few slides are pretty hard to look at. but virtually every creature, every living organism on Earth is harmed by plastic. With all this to worry about, and with scientists warning us that at least since 5 years ago, that plastic pollution is as great a threat to life on Earth as climate change, now we'll get to what we can do about it. So, of course, that dire prediction came before COVID. As Alex discussed, COVID has just made the problem go even worse than it ever was before. But on another level, it's given people a wake-up call that we have to take action and we have to work collectively to fix these problems, including plastics. So you won't be surprised to learn that given that we live in a very capitalist world, there are a lot of phony greenwashing and fake solutions to this, as Alex also mentioned. They seem, but we'll start with a few things that we can do on our own or in our own households or communities. They may seem small and insignificant, but really they're needed. As Alex pointed out, learn what you can do. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my slides here. So Coca-Cola, one of the worst polluting companies, Senior Vice President and Sustainability Officer B. Perez claimed at last year's World Economic Forum that the country would continue selling single-use plastic bottles because customers preferred them, she said. But people deny wanting them. Coca-Cola essentially doesn't give a hoot what people want. They'll continue doing what's expedient and makes the most money because that's their job. That's what they do. The same with all these other worst polluting plastic companies like Pepsi, Nestle, Mars, Procter & Gamble, Colgate, Palmolive, each of whom has hundreds of brands. Most of us have them in our homes, but we can choose not to buy their products. Buy generics and whenever possible, local brands to replace those companies' products. There's even a listing of glass bottle soda pop selling companies here at glassbottlesoda.org. You can check out. It has numerous ones and they're in every state in the Union, in the United States and in many other countries. So it should go by now without saying that no one should use, and every municipality and state and nation should ban single-use plastics of every kind. If your own town doesn't have one, start a campaign. It's become a pretty easy sell, especially if you show people pictures like this, which is coming up, I hope. Every year during my years at Ithaca College, when my students were graduating, I gave them a gift. It was a metal straw and a brush to clean it with, a set of bamboo spork and knife, and chopsticks, and they were all in a hand sewn satchel. It was my gift to them. This is the picture you can show people who are reluctant to talk about plastic bag bans. One of my students who graduated in 2012 and is now a high school teacher is doing that same thing with his students, paying it forward. It's a little thing, but it's significant. It raises consciousness. If you're fortunate to live in an area with a food cooperative or a grocery store where you can buy bulk grains, beans, coffee, tea, flour, oils, and the like, do your best to circumvent their rules about not bringing your own containers. For years, I managed to avoid the health department rules that people can't bring their own. I befriended a guy in the deli department of a grocery store, and I knew when he was on duty. I always brought my own container, which I'd actually originally gotten from that very store, and I asked him to refill it and hand me the sticker that normally he would put on the container with the weight and price. And rather than putting it on the container, I just put it on a piece of paper that I brought. And then when I went to the clerk to pay, they just scanned those things on one piece of paper. So I could keep using that same container over and over and over again. I still have some that I have had for at least 10 years. And then if I ordered something that would be generally wrapped in plastic and then in paper, such as like cheese or deli items, I'd make sure he skipped the plastic and only use the paper. And if you're not vegan, you can even make or invest in your own beeswax coated cotton wraps that you can reuse for years and years. At that grocery store, there was also a salad bar, olive bar, and I would weigh the items and again do the same thing with the stickers, put them on a single sheet of paper. And then of course I take my leftover container when I eat at restaurants, although not often do I have leftovers, but generally, of course, I try to avoid buying anything in plastic, but it's impossible to do this all the time. A really nice subversive thing that I tend to do all the time is unwrap anything that's wrapped in excessive plastic and bring it and drop it off at the customer service center. They really don't like that. And sometimes I've actually mailed the plastic back to the offending company with a really nasty note. And so refusing plastic, you change our family motto to refuse, reduce, and reuse. So, I mean, it is a little thing, but if enough of us were to do that, the top brass at stores would get really pissed off and they would pressure their suppliers to lessen the amount of plastic. I had to throw this in here because there are a few things that annoy me more than getting organic lettuce in a hard plastic case like this, or any organic vegetables in these horrific, nightmarish sleeves, these plastic sleeves. They're awful. So just say no to these whenever you can. Buy things in bulk. Instead of picking the convenient bag of onions, pick 10 onions and put them in your bag and have them weighed. The thing is, this kind of small campaign can really work, especially if you live in a relatively small enough city or a neighborhood and enlist some friends to do this with you. So a few years ago, some people who used to meet at a bar for political griping with a group called Drinking Liberally joined me in a personalized letter writing campaign to a hotel chain that was playing faux news on its lobby in our town. And we discovered that every single hotel in that chain was doing the same thing. It was a company-wide policy to play faux news. So six of us wrote letters. Only 6 of us wrote letters, each one different, and we handed them to other people in our group to customize them and send them themselves. And we sent them to the local hotel manager as well as to the corporate headquarters. Each of those people got another 2 people. So altogether, we only had about 30 letters that went, and it succeeded. We got the entire chain to stop running that offending channel. And I bet that was more effective than if we had had 1,000 people signing on to an online campaign petition. So, and I checked the following year, I visited one of those hotel chains in another city, and they still weren't playing faux news. I'm not sure if that's lasted, but we did a similar thing. We were able to stop a major pharmacy from allowing its employees to refuse to sell morning after pills to people on religious grounds, and that worked as well. And more pertinent to this conversation, another such letter writing campaign succeeded in getting a grocery store chain to pressure its organic eggs supplier to stop using these hard plastic non-returnable containers. So we can also be mindful of everything we choose to buy, from soft drinks to furniture, menstrual products to refrigerators. And we can be vocal about what we want and what we don't want, both with decision makers and with local media. I've been told by more than 5 US Congress members that if I hear from 3 or 5 people, I'll look into the matter and maybe act on it. And with local lawmakers, they're often responsive to pressure from a determined group of small group of determined, persistent pests. And as for corporations, even though they couldn't care less if they're poisoning our air, water, soil, and kids, they don't like to get negative press. Now, the fact is we're not only buried in plastic, but we've come to rely on it just in a few short decades. Some of our more mature folks may remember getting milk delivered to our doorsteps in returnable glass bottles. Well, some community dairies still offer this service or are beginning to do so again. Let's encourage that, not only for milk, but for every other thing that could just as easily be packaged in truly recyclable glass, metal, or cardboard. One of the worst offenders, not surprisingly, is Big Pharma, which insists on packing 30 pills in a container that could hold 300. That's a whole campaign waiting to be waged. And here I am, I'm sitting at my plastic keyboard, using my plastic mouse and my partly plastic computer, wearing plastic glasses. There are just a lot of plastic things we can't live without. The idea is to make sure they last as long as we do. Nothing single use, nothing short term, as Alex pointed out. Resist temptation to buy anything that's encased in plastic if it doesn't actually need to be encased in plastic. Even light bulbs can be put in, should be housed in cardboard, not plastic. And if you're moving houses, you'll be horrified to learn that packing companies will use up dozens of rolls of big plastic stretch wrap to encase every single item you own, around and around and around again like this. Most of it can never be reused because when you pull it apart, it sticks together, it's stretchy. So demand that if you're moving, they use paper or fabric. Pack your own stuff in something that can be reused. And if you do end up with tons of bubble wrap or paper wrap or any other such thing, don't throw it away. Don't try to recycle it. Donate it. Somebody else is going to be moving, somebody in your community. Give it to the next person and make them promise that they will pay it forward as well. This stuff is horrible and we need to keep it out of the waste stream. If you have a plastic item or appliance and it breaks, learn to fix it or take it to a local fix-it group. In the Finger Lakes of New York, where I lived for many years until recently, and where Alex lives now, there are two wonderful reuse centers founded in 2008 as the brainchild of a visionary woman named Diane Cohen. They have a fixers collective and a building dismantling service and a salvage operation as well. They're so popular and well run that my husband and I didn't ever need to buy a new piece of furniture or luggage or lamps or appliances, wall sconces, doors, windows, you name it. We always also had a place to bring things that we no longer could use or that we needed to fix. It's a really worthwhile venture, and it keeps many people happily employed, making a living wage. Finger Lakes Reuse also very generously also offers a template business plan for starting a similar venture in your own community. So think about bringing something like this to your town if it doesn't have one, and think about sharing certain high ticket, seldom used things like, say, a chainsaw or a power washer or a leaf blower or a snow plow or a power drill or a hot plate or juicer or stock pot or canning equipment with people in your neighborhood, or start an appliance or power tool lending library. So let's go back to starting a little bit about the false choices, many of them that are being championed by industries that benefit from, from plastic production or proliferation. Remember that plastic's a byproduct of fossil fuel extraction, and those who benefit are among the biggest polluters on the planet who harm human and other natural communities in myriad ways. So you always have to be suspect when you hear of a scheme that's being pushed by any of them or joined by any of them, even if they're in partnership with so-called environmental nonprofit organizations. First of all, as Alex wrote in his piece about what's recyclable, what's not, just because it has a number inside a little triangle doesn't mean it really can be recycled. The sad fact is that really only numbers 1 and 2. 1 is polyethylene terephthalate or PET, and number 2 is terephthalate. It's very hard to say. It's hard to spell too. If you can't spell it, you don't want it. And high density polyethylene or HDPE are safe to recycle in most areas of the United States and elsewhere. PET number 1 is usually water bottles and salad dressing bottles and things like that. And HDPE number 2 is like shampoo bottles, milk jugs. And as Alex pointed out, only about 9 or 10% of all plastic in the entire world is recycled. And when China stopped taking it in 2018, all the municipalities around the world ended up with a glut of stuff, and they have no way to treat it or do anything, no facilities to recycle it at all. So that should make municipal leaders more willing to take drastic action, but it doesn't always work that way. Just make sure that you always know the rules in your own municipality, and don't risk making the mistake that many of us well-intentioned people do by contaminating a whole batch of stuff by putting the wrong thing in the wrong bin. So there's a lot of dangerous misinformation and phony industry spin. For example, bisphenol A or BPA is used in the inner linings of a lot of cans and jar lids and flooring and adhesives and paints, electronics, even dental fillings and crowns and kids' toys and baby products. And BPA started getting a lot of media attention as a bad thing when it was revealed to be an endocrine disruptor that's linked to infertility, early onset puberty, tumors such as breast tumors and prostate tumors and other metabolic disorders. And it may also be linked to cancers and obesity, diabetes, and other diseases. And concentrations of this stuff are 11 times higher in infants. So the European Union restricted its use, but the United States wonderful Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, still claims it's safe. So because it got a lot of media attention, people didn't want it anymore. So here came its replacement, bisphenol S or BPS, and now companies are using this and saying that it's BPA free, so it's great. It's become a common marketing slogan, as you see on this baby bottle. But it also has hormonal effects. Reproductive endocrinologist Nancy L. Wayne says, BPA free is a marketing scheme or scam. Industries are swapping out one endocrine disrupting chemical for another. Now, let's be clear, as I tell students right away, when we're talking about these endocrine disruptive chemicals, which are rampant throughout the entire life cycle of fossil fuels, from extraction to distribution to use to plastics, we're talking about their gonads here, their reproductive systems that usually grab students' attentions even when they don't care about other species. Another brief mention of the health effects on humans and others, which could actually inform a whole week-long series of webinars, is that plastics serve as vectors for disease and carriers of organisms we don't want. As transporters, microplastics in our waters can provide a new habitat for invasive species and pathogens like COVID that previously never would have reached human and other species communities. So as Alex also mentioned, we published another piece yesterday at System Change, Not Climate Change. This is the last in the series. This is about the bio-based and biodegradable plastics, which I hope you'll read. But for now, I'll skip to the heart of the matter and reiterate what Alex said. They're not even remotely a solution. They're in many ways worse because mixing them in with regular plastic can contaminate an entire truckload or a whole load, and sending it all to the landfill. And from there, it's going to end up you know where. It's very confusing, and you practically need a PhD in the subject to even understand the complexity of it. But Bethany Jurgensen, whom Alex interviewed, she's a researcher at Cornell University, and she explained it to Alex like this. Some of these new plastics are biodegradable. Some of them are bio-based. Just because they are biodegradable doesn't mean that they are 100% coming from non-petroleum sources. A lot of them use at least some percentage of fossil fuel derived chemicals as part of their makeup. And just because some are bio-based plastics doesn't mean they're necessarily going to biodegrade faster than conventional plastic. When I lived in Ithaca, our well-known local farmers market switched to all cornstarch-based plastic cups, plates and tablewares one year. A few years later, we went to visit the community composting facility and saw them still there, still intact. And this greatly hyped program was abandoned to everyone's disappointment. But they hadn't known that while some things might eventually decompose, it takes a very intensive composting operation with high heat and or sun and or copious amounts of water for them to degrade. And currently there are only 112 appropriate facilities, all taking up 10 acres or more in size in the whole United States. But that doesn't keep a whole lot of companies from trying to get in on the so-called biodegradable, bio-based plastics action. We should forget altogether about bioplastics for now. So there are a host of other phony, quote, solutions, including waste to energy schemes like gasification and other burning methods, but they're equally counterproductive to our goals for a clean and livable Mother Earth. So let's talk about government action without which nothing good will happen, period. How can anyone still believe that corporations within the capitalist free market system would have any chance, let alone desire, of solving these spectacularly huge problems of their own making? I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that only massive governmental overhaul of current laws and introduction of strict, new, enforceable regulations on every level, from villages to the European Union and other international bodies, will turn the tide against plastic and its parent fossil fuels. And so far, the US government under Joe Biden has not been doing what it should, nor have many other governments that get a lot of attention for their supposedly green initiatives. Costa Rica, for example, often praised for environmental stewardship, pronounced in 2018 that it would be plastic-free by 2021. That was a joke. It wasn't, it was touted in the media as a great thing, but it was a complete joke. And the same thing with Sri Lanka, which did a similar promise. Roughly 400 municipalities around the USA have restricted plastic bags in some way, or single-use items. This follows the national trend of cities leading the way on environmental policy, but and these efforts do prove, they do provide a little bit of hope for a future. But if structural barriers exist, mostly preemptive laws were enacted by politicians influenced by the plastic industry will keep having the same problem. Statewide single-use bans and restrictive laws were seriously set back during COVID, as Alex has pointed out, and that gave industry yet another bonanza. New York delayed its bag ban in response to COVID, and California paused its tax on bags. They're just 2 of 8 states with regulations, but most of the regulations have plenty of loopholes.
Maura, can we wrap it up in a minute or so?
Yeah, I'm just going to be another couple of minutes. Okay. Pennsylvania is very backward. They placed restrictions on municipalities for bans, and there is a national ban introduced by someone in the House and someone in the Senate, called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, but it's quite full of loopholes. Still, it's the best that the U.S. has and probably worth supporting. And there's an international fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which I urge everybody to learn about. It's you can sign on to it as an individual or a group at fossilfueltreaty.org. And it really calls for exactly what we need. And there are some issues working on plastics issues, organizations working on plastics issues that you might want to check out. This will all be available later. And I have a little list of things to remember as we're closing out. I'll leave this up as David comes back in. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Maura and Alex. So we'd like to open it up to the audience now to pose questions and ask that audience members take no more than 1 or 2 minutes to speak. And then we'll ask Maura and Alex to respond as concisely as possible so that people can do that. So if you want to ask a question, go to the chat and write the word question or write the word stack, and I will try to call on you in order. And while I'm waiting for that, let me ask the speakers, what's the connection to capitalism with the plastic explosion? You know, prior to World War II, you hardly saw any plastic. Plastic wasn't mass produced before World War II. And we, you know, we go back, we look at those old black and white movies from the 40s and where there was no plastic around and somehow people lived, some of them were happy. Could we do that? And is capitalism stopping us from doing that? What's going on with that?
Did you want to go more? Or should
I
take it?
will. Well, yes, the answer is yes. Capitalism is stopping us from any really effective change. Capitalism is what drives everything. It drives all the production of everything on the planet. And under a capitalist system, it's pretty much impossible to halt it. Giving corporations the power of, you know, to essentially make our laws and make our regulations or non-regulations, allowing things not to be regulated, not to enforce any regulations, is, you know, it's a suicidal mission. And yes, you're right. The proliferation of, there was virtually no plastic up until the 20s and 30s. During World War II, many plastic things were introduced. It became profitable for companies to give people convenience. They marketed especially to women about convenience. Plastic will make your life easier. You can have a plastic vacuum cleaner. You can have a plastic food that you can stick in a microwave oven, which I hope nobody does. Don't use any plastic in any microwave oven, even if it says it's safe for microwaves. So anyway, my answer is, the answer is, under capitalism, we probably don't have much of a chance of stopping it, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I see Ted put in the chat, capitalism equals private decision-making about what is produced. And it's not the best individuals in the world who are put in charge of things, I would say, under capitalism. Let's see, what other questions do we have here? I see no one has put anything in chat yet, but.
Wait, I saw Catherine asked a question.
Oh, Catherine asked a question, sorry. Oh, yes, Catherine, do you want to, can we put Catherine on video? And you can ask it yourself? If not, I can read it, but.
Yeah, hi, and I think somebody had a question before me too. David Jones also posted a question, but I'll read mine. I've always been involved in animal rights and have those photos of animal suffering, non-human animal suffering, help persuade the public against plastic. I mean, you can't see the credit card in our stomach so much, and you can't always see the results, but that's such a visual evidence against the horrors of it. And I think I might have posted in LinkedIn to one of Alex's posts that I've bought those bracelets from 4Ocean to help, and given them as gifts to people to help promote awareness. I wonder if there's enough awareness about it.
So the short answer is kind of yes and no. For instance, in the first part of the article, I brought up Christine Figener, who is a ex-marine biologist. She now works at Footprint Foundation, working on solutions to different plastic issues. But she posted an image of a turtle with a straw stuck in its nose. It went viral online and led to a lot of different places adopting like paper straws and getting rid of their plastic straws. And that was a really short-term bubble that more or less has popped in in my opinion, but it did create a lot of short-term momentum for just advocacy for plastics and animals, specifically like trying to help them. But in the terms of like people dissecting seagulls and seeing that they just have like bottle caps stuck in their stomach, that is not really going anywhere. I think it was incredibly lucky that the turtle with a straw stuck in his nose became as popular as it did, because many other similar scenarios are not really being publicized. And then animals that are getting trapped in like fish nets and the fishing industry in general, like no one's really paying attention to the cruelty that the animals are facing within that on a massive scale.
Okay, great. Let's see, I did skip David Jones. So David, would you like to pose your question verbally, or should I read it? Can we put Dave Jones on? Oh, you're on mute, Dave. There you are. Oops, you had it there for a second. Can you unmute? Let's see, you're still muted, so I'm gonna go ahead and read it. So Dave Jones asks, can you speak to the effect of plastic on all the fish we eat?
So because of how microplastics work, they do, I forget the exact biological term for it, but their prevalence increases in parts per million as you go further up the food chain because of intensification. So a single plankton eats 1 or 3 pieces, and then a whale eats 1,500 plankton. And that continues on and on the food chain, although I did just skip straight to the top with whales. But basically, yeah, there's a massive amount of plastic in our food. And as far as taste, I don't think most people notice, but it does make our fish a lot less healthy, meaning they're less nutritious for us. So we're getting more plastic than we are nutrition from them. As in specifics, I can't specifically talk. I don't know that specific answer.
Okay, let's see. I see that Nancy Holmstrom has a question. So can we unmute Richard's?
Yes, we did.
Go ahead,
Okay.
go ahead, Nancy.
These are 2 factual questions. I'm just ignorant. Given that I never paid attention to the number within the recycling, I've probably thrown away a lot of plastic bottles and other things that couldn't be recycled. Does that mean, how does the corruption of the container work? Is it better if you're not sure just to not throw it away? What should you do? That's one question. The other question is, why is baby's poop more plastic filled than ours?
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, so in terms of babies, they just have one source of food, and it's their parents. So it's basically, they're much smaller than us, and they're getting all of the plastic that we've ingested that enters our mammary glands, and that's kind of where that comes from, just like intensification, much like how fish eat a lunch of plastic. That not much plastic was eaten by a krill, but so not much plastic might have been eaten by the mom, only a credit card a week, but that one credit card then goes into a baby, which is an 18th of the size of the mother. And in terms of
So it's through nursing?
Yeah, if I remember the article correctly. It's been a couple days since I've read it.
So mom's milk is plastic.
Yeah, and in terms of whether or not to throw something out, if you don't know whether it's recyclable or not, you run a greater chance of ruining an entire batch of good recyclables, which is what happens to a lot. That's why only 10% is recycled, because a batch gets contaminated with someone's plastic that got melted in that wasn't capable of being melted in with the rest of it, and ends up ruining an entire batch, such as what happens with high density polyurethane and low density polyurethane. They don't melt at the same temperature, and they refine into different things, so it just messes up the entire chain.
Yeah, I would just say,
Can I add
if,
a little point to that?
okay,
Yeah,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
I only discovered through an article of a couple of weeks ago or so that corporations are free to print whatever label they want onto their plastic, 2, 3, 4, 7, whatever they want, because there apparently are no laws about this. They can do whatever they want. So someplace, Berkeley or Oakland or something, is suing the government to prevent the companies from marking their products or their wrappers as recyclable when in fact they are actually not recyclable. So apart from the fact that except for categories 1 and 2, the rest are pretty much not recyclable anyway, we have the problem of whole lots of stuff being labeled as recyclable, which isn't recyclable in any practical sense anyway. I mean, the whole recyclability of plastic is just, it's just a fucking fraud, you know. It's just a way to keep going producing this shit and keep going. It just, you know, it's just endless.
you're
And
absolutely right, Richard.
The only solution is to stop this stuff, ban it, you know. But
And that's a nice connection to capitalism too.
yeah,
So that's an example of
there
where
it's not
profit is.
and there it's not just, I was going to add about capitalism, that it's not just the companies. Of course the companies want to do this, but Americans, people are seduced by convenience, and they don't protest, they don't think about it. Or also in capitalism, we're just alienated from one another. Enemy, alienation, the fact that nobody knows any of this stuff, and most people don't really care very much, at least care enough to try to do anything about it. And we're all so separated, it seems like it's so impossible. I mean, I think the chances of getting legislation about this stuff are next to nil, short of some very large campaigns. And I think it's possible to build campaigns. I mean, I tried to get the DSA Ecosocialist Working Group interested in doing an anti-plastics campaign. That went nowhere. But I don't know what else to do. You know, I mean, we can't do it. We're too small. But you know, I think if you had groups of people standing out in front of, like, say, you know, Whole Foods or any big grocery store with pictures of those turtles and ducks and birds and whatnot.
We need some kittens and puppies. That would get
Yeah, well, whatever, you know. I think that reaches people's hearts more than you know, reading papers or whatnot and articles and so forth. They see it, but the images are very powerful, and they can have an effect if people can organize in ways to do that. And the anti-plastics groups that you listed there at the end there, they do that stuff online and so forth. But you know, you need a physical campaign of people, organized people in, you know, in protests, small protests, large protests, whatever, at you know,
Well, activism is
like
always much better in
of
person.
Whole Foods, for example, you know, about all their organic produce that's wrapped in boxes of plastic. You know, it's just.
We have a question or a comment from Martha McClintock, who's
Yeah, Martha, can you go ahead and ask?
Yes. Hi, Maura. I've started tabling all on my own at my farmer's market. And if you have a farmer's market, that's a self-selecting community of people who care about numerous things. So my tabling is about climate change right now. We're getting ready to have a pollinators awareness thing on how climate change is affecting pollinators, because all the people who are going to the farmer's market are willing to pay more. They have a passion for food. They want things that are organic, etc. So a single individual can do things even without photographs, even without permission from other people. You can just go set up a card table, whatever it is that you have, and you'll be surprised the number of people that will come over to you and want to engage with you, and will be relieved to know there are other people that think like they do, that care.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes. Are there other questions from people who haven't spoken yet? One thing I might ask, this is sort of a scientific question. You know, the Earth climate system has a way to decarbonize the atmosphere naturally. It takes hundreds of thousands of years, but there is a system involving chemical weathering and then the you know, subduction into the ocean. is there anything comparable to that for plastics? Does the Earth have any natural system at all for getting rid of plastic from the biosphere? Or does it just last forever?
Well, I believe that some of the plastics pretty much last forever. I mean, 10,000 years or so, including some of those that are being marketed as biodegradable. So, I mean, you would understand the science as well as anyone, David. Maybe you can elaborate on it for us.
I really don't know. You know, I mean, there's these plastic microparticles, and then what? You know, do they just stay forever? I don't know.
From what I understand, they do. They're pretty much never ending.
Okay, very quickly, we have a question from Ann Finneran. Ann? Let's see, can you unmute yourself? Let's see, Ann is still muted. Go ahead, Ann.
I was just thinking in terms of, my timer just went off. Okay. I was just thinking in terms of planned obsolescence. And as far as like writing campaigns to tech industries about, you know, if they're going to keep reselling this stuff, they should be responsible for the packaging of our cell phones, packaging of our laptops and the computers and the shells. And I don't know, just the thought, it's a pretty big campaign to undertake, but it's just going this.
I just say that, you know, appealing to corporations to do the right thing is basically a waste of time. They're not going to do the right thing. It's not in their DNA. Their mission is to make money only for them, the shareholders and the top level executives in the corporation, the boards of directors. They have no obligation to do what's right for humanity, for other species, for the future of our whole existence. There's nothing in it. So I think it's a total waste of time. We have to force our governments. We have to, first of all, you know, so many governments are in the pocket of industry. So many government legislators, decision makers, policy makers are captured by industry. And that's the way it's got to be in capitalism. Capitalism can't survive unless it plays that game. I mean, that's part of our whole, it's not just the political and economic structure, as someone pointed out earlier, it's the whole society. Our whole society is based on consumption. We're not people, we're consumers, right? So I don't think that appealing to corporations is the way to go. And the built-in obsolescence is just getting shorter and shorter, as we learned with the recent Apple, you know, the surveillance thing, where now that my iPhone 6 has got to be replaced because it's too old. I bought it in 2016. So.
Well, okay, on that note, I think we should thank the speakers. Once again, let me invite audience members to go to our website, systemchange.climatechange.org, and we would love to have you involved. We have a listserv. That would be a first step toward connecting with us. And so you can send an email message from that website and request to be a part of the discussion and organizing of activities.